For centuries, the Middle Ages have lived in our imagination wrapped in fantasy. When we think of medieval clothing, we picture flowing gowns, bright colors, elaborate designs, and a world dressed as if it were permanently prepared for a festival or a painting. These images feel familiar, comforting, and cinematic, yet they are largely inherited illusions, shaped by art, literature, and modern entertainment rather than by lived reality. The clothes worn by ordinary medieval men and women were not designed to enchant the eye or express personal style. They were built to endure a difficult world, to survive cold winters, exhausting labor, limited resources, and constant exposure to the elements. Clothing in the medieval period was not about choice. It was about necessity, protection, and endurance. To understand medieval life, we must first abandon the idea of clothing as decoration. In a world without industrial production, synthetic fabrics, or fast replacement, every garment carried weight, time, and labor within its fibers. What someone wore immediately revealed how they lived, where they stood in society, and what kind of future they could realistically expect. A tunic, a cloak, or a pair of worn shoes were not neutral objects. They were daily tools of survival, shaped by climate, economy, and social order. Fabric was expensive, colors were limited, and a single mistake in production could cost months of work. As a result, clothing was used until it could no longer protect the body. This reality forces us to see medieval clothing not as costume, but as lived history. What people wore was inseparable from the harshness of their environment, from the slow rhythm of manual labor, and from the rigid structure of medieval society. The garment did not begin as a symbol. It became one over time through use, wear, and visibility. To follow the story of medieval clothing is to follow the story of survival itself, from the fields to the streets, from the home to public life. Only by starting here can we understand how fabric, labor, hierarchy, dignity, and shame were all woven together on the medieval body, forming a silent language that everyone could read. Medieval clothing emerged from a world defined by physical hardship and environmental uncertainty. Life unfolded under open skies, on uneven ground, and through long seasons of cold, rain, wind, and labor that left little room for comfort. To be dressed in the Middle Ages was not to be adorned, but to be shielded. The body needed protection not only from winter frost, but from daily abrasion, from mud, smoke, rough tools, and relentless work that began at dawn and ended only when light disappeared. Clothing functioned as a second skin, absorbing the strain that the human body alone could not endure. Without it, survival itself was placed at risk. The medieval climate was unforgiving. Winters were longer and harsher than those we know today, and homes offered limited insulation against cold and moisture. Fire provided warmth, but smoke clung to everything, settling into fabric and skin alike. Rain soaked garments slowly and dried them even more slowly, especially in regions where dampness lingered for weeks. Under these conditions, clothing was expected to perform constantly. It needed to retain heat, repel wind, and withstand repeated exposure to moisture without falling apart. A cloak was not an accessory, but a portable shelter. A tunic was not casual wear, but daily armor against abrasion and cold. Even in summer, garments protected the body from sunburn, insects, and injury during agricultural labor. The scarcity of resources shaped every choice. Fabric was not easily replaced, and garments were not rotated by season. Most people owned very few pieces, often relying on the same clothing year-round, adapting it as needed rather than changing it. Layers mattered more than variety. A heavier outer garment might be worn continuously through winter and retained well into spring, despite discomfort, because warmth outweighed ease. In this context, inconvenience was accepted as part of life. Comfort, as we understand it today, had little relevance. Survival dictated priorities, and clothing followed those demands faithfully. Labor defined the medieval day, and clothing was forced to adapt to it. Fields, workshops, kitchens, and roads imposed constant stress on fabric. Bending, lifting, kneeling, and walking long distances wore garments down quickly, especially at seams and hems. Dirt and sweat were unavoidable companions, embedding themselves deeply into fibers. Washing was laborious and infrequent, and repeated cleaning weakened the cloth. As a result, medieval garments were constructed with endurance in mind. They were cut simply, avoiding unnecessary excess that could tear or snag. Function came before form, and longevity outweighed refinement. A garment that lasted years, even if rough and heavy, was far more valuable than one that looked pleasing but failed under strain. The body itself was understood as vulnerable. Illness, injury, and exposure were constant threats, and clothing formed a basic defense against them. Keeping the body warm reduced sickness. Covering the skin prevented cuts and infections. A torn garment was not merely inconvenient, but dangerous, especially in colder months. To lose adequate clothing could mean losing health, dignity, and the ability to work. In a society where survival depended on physical contribution, the inability to work quickly became a matter of life and death. Clothing, therefore, was deeply tied to economic survival as well as physical protection. This relationship between clothing and endurance shaped medieval attitudes toward appearance. Beauty, when it existed, emerged indirectly from care, maintenance, and suitability rather than from decoration. A well-kept garment signaled stability and competence, not fashion. Excessive display was impractical for most and often suspicious, suggesting wastefulness or detachment from labor. The visible signs of wear, faded fabric, patched areas, and softened fibers were not failures, but evidence of persistence. They told a story of a garment that had done its job and continued to do so despite adversity. Through this lens, medieval clothing becomes inseparable from the world that produced it. Each piece was shaped by weather, work, and scarcity, long before it carried any social meaning. Survival came first and everything else followed. Only after clothing had fulfilled its essential role as protection did it begin to communicate something more, quietly revealing patterns of labor, access, and endurance that structured medieval life. Behind every medieval garment lay a long and demanding process that transformed raw material into something capable of protecting a human body. Clothing did not begin in workshops filled with machines, nor did it appear quickly through trade or purchase. It began in fields and pastures, with sheep raised for wool and flax, cultivated for linen, and it unfolded through months of repetitive, physically exhausting labor. Fabric itself was precious because time was precious. Each step, from preparation to completion, demanded attention, strength, and patience, and failure at any stage could undo weeks or even months of work. Wool dominated medieval clothing because it answered the needs of survival better than any other material. It retained heat even when damp, resisted tearing, and could be produced locally in most regions. Yet wool was far from simple. After shearing, it needed to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread, and woven into cloth, all by hand. Spinning alone consumed countless hours, often performed while standing, walking, or watching over children and animals. The thread then had to be woven on looms that required skill and physical coordination. The resulting fabric was strong but rarely soft, especially for those who could not afford extensive finishing or refinement. Linen, made from flax, demanded even greater effort. The fibers required soaking, drying, breaking, and combing before they could be spun, and the process was highly sensitive to weather and timing. Linen garments were lighter and cooler, but their production placed them beyond the reach of many. This labor unfolded primarily within the household, woven into daily life rather than separated from it. Textile production was not an isolated craft, but a continuous background activity, often carried out by women alongside cooking, childcare, and other domestic responsibilities. The rhythm of medieval clothing production followed the rhythm of life itself, slow and unyielding. There was no rush, because there could be no rush. A single garment might represent a season of work, or more, and its value was understood not only in material terms, but in the effort embedded within it. Because of this, clothing was never disposable. A finished garment was expected to last as long as possible, and its life did not end when it showed signs of wear. Tears were repaired, weak areas reinforced, and patches added wherever fabric began to fail. These repairs were not hidden. They accumulated visibly, marking the passage of time on the surface of the garment. When clothing could no longer serve its original purpose, it was altered, resized, or repurposed. Adult garments became children's clothing. Worn pieces were cut down, reshaped, or layered to extend their usefulness. Nothing was wasted unless it was completely beyond recovery. The slowness of production shaped medieval attitudes toward ownership. To possess a garment was to hold condensed time in one's hands. Clothing carried memory, not sentimentally, but materially. It bore the traces of seasons past, of bodies grown or aged, of labor repeated daily. Inherited garments were common, not because of nostalgia, but because fabric outlived individuals. A tunic might pass through multiple lives, each wearer adapting it to new needs. In this way, clothing connected generations through shared material history, binding families together through continuity rather than novelty. Trade introduced variety, but only at the margins. Imported fabrics existed, but they were costly and limited in availability. Their presence marked difference rather than normality. For most medieval people, clothing came from familiar materials produced close to home, shaped by local conditions and skills. This reinforced regional uniformity, where garments reflected environment more than personal preference. What someone wore was not chosen freely, but inherited through geography, climate, and community. Time, labor, and fabric were inseparable. The value of medieval clothing lay not in its appearance, but in its endurance and reliability. A garment that protected the body through years of work fulfilled its purpose fully. Only within this framework can we understand how clothing later came to signal social order. Before it could speak of rank or power, it first had to survive. The visible differences between garments did not begin as deliberate symbols, but emerged naturally from unequal access to time, resources, and labor. Clothing became language only after it had already proven itself as necessity. In medieval society, clothing functioned as a silent but precise system of recognition. Long before a word was spoken, a person's garments announced their place in the world. This was not a matter of personal expression, but of collective understanding. Everyone learned to read clothing instinctively, interpreting fabric, color, cut, and condition as clear indicators of status, occupation, and authority. In a world where mobility was limited and communities were tightly structured, appearance became one of the most immediate ways to locate someone within the social hierarchy. The differences were rarely dramatic in form, but they were unmistakable in detail. The quality of fabric revealed access to resources, while its condition reflected stability or struggle. Coarser wool signaled manual labor and necessity, while finer weaves suggested relative comfort and distance from constant physical work. Linen garments, especially when well maintained, marked higher standing, not because they were decorative, but because they required time and effort beyond basic survival. Even the way a garment fell on the body mattered. Length, fit, and layering subtly distinguished those who worked with their hands from those whose roles allowed greater freedom of movement and cleanliness. Color reinforced this visual language. Most medieval clothing remained close to natural tones, shaped by the limits of dyeing technology and the cost of pigments. When stronger colors appeared, they carried meaning. They indicated access to trade, wealth, or privilege. Certain hues became closely associated with authority and power, not by chance, but by deliberate restriction. Sumptuary laws emerged to regulate who could wear specific fabrics, colors, or decorative elements. These laws did not create hierarchy, they protected it. By controlling appearance, medieval societies ensured that social boundaries remained visible and unquestioned. Clothing also marked occupation. The garments of farmers, artisans, clergy, merchants, and nobles differed not through dramatic design, but through function and maintenance. Those engaged in heavy labor wore clothing shaped by movement and durability, often shorter or more tightly secured to the body. Clerical dress communicated separation from manual work and alignment with religious authority, emphasizing modesty, continuity, and symbolic distance from worldly labor. Merchants occupied an intermediate space, their clothing reflecting both practicality and growing access to refined materials. Nobility, though still constrained by the realities of fabric production, displayed distinction through layered garments, finer finishes, and controlled use of color. Condition mattered as much as material. A patched garment told a story of prolonged use and limited replacement, while an unblemished one suggested security. Cleanliness, though difficult to maintain, signaled order and discipline. These visible differences shaped daily interactions. Respect, deference, and expectation followed appearance closely. Clothing guided behavior on both sides, determining who spoke first, who stepped aside, and who commanded attention. The system functioned smoothly because it was widely understood and rarely challenged. This visual order extended into public and legal life. Courtrooms, marketplaces, churches, and assemblies relied on clothing to reinforce roles. Authority figures dressed in ways that emphasized continuity and legitimacy, not extravagance. The aim was not excess, but recognition. To dress incorrectly, whether by choice or necessity, risked misunderstanding or punishment. Wearing clothing above one's station could provoke suspicion or hostility, while appearing too poor could invite exclusion or shame. Clothing did not merely reflect status, it helped enforce it. Yet this system was not abstract. It rested on the realities already woven into fabric through labor and scarcity. The social meaning of clothing emerged from unequal access to resources, not from symbolic invention alone. Those who had more could maintain better garments. Those who had less adapted and repaired. The hierarchy was visible because inequality was real. Clothing translated that reality into a shared visual language that structured medieval life. By the time a medieval garment communicated authority or subordination, it had already fulfilled its practical purpose many times over. The social order was not imposed upon clothing arbitrarily. It grew out of necessity. What people wore became a map of their place in the world, read effortlessly by everyone around them. And because this map was carried on the body itself, it was impossible to escape. Clothing followed individuals everywhere, reinforcing belonging, difference, and expectation in every public encounter. In the medieval world, clothing did more than mark survival, labor, and social position. It carried dignity itself. To be properly clothed was to be recognized as fully human within the community. Garments protected not only the body but the social self, preserving a person's place among others and shielding them from exposure, judgment, and exclusion. The loss or degradation of clothing threatened far more than comfort. It endangered identity. Medieval society understood this instinctively, and for that reason, clothing became a powerful medium through which honor and shame were communicated without ambiguity. Cleanliness and maintenance played a central role in this fragile balance. Washing clothing required water, time, and physical effort, and it wore fabric down with every attempt. Yet neglecting cleanliness carried visible consequences. Dirt, odor, and decay were read as signs of disorder, poverty, or marginalization. Smell lingered in fabric, absorbing smoke, sweat, and dampness, and there was no way to erase it completely. This is why oils, perfumes, and herbs were valued, not as luxuries of vanity, but as tools of coexistence. To care for one's clothing was to care for one's standing in the world, even when resources were scarce. A well-maintained garment, even if old and patched, communicated discipline and self-respect. Repairs were not shameful in themselves. On the contrary, they demonstrated effort and responsibility. What carried shame was exposure, neglect, and visible loss of control over one's appearance. Clothing acted as a boundary between the individual and public scrutiny. When that boundary failed, the consequences were immediate and harsh. To appear inadequately clothed was to invite judgment, suspicion, or pity, all of which reduced a person's agency within the community. This is why acts involving clothing held deep symbolic and emotional weight. To strip someone of their garments was to strip them of protection, status, and belonging all at once. Forced exposure represented the collapse of social identity, reducing the individual to vulnerability before the collective gaze. Punishments that involved the removal or destruction of clothing were designed to humiliate rather than merely harm. They declared that the person no longer occupied a protected place within society. Shame was not private, it was public, deliberate, and understood by all who witnessed it. Conversely, to be clothed appropriately in communal rituals signaled inclusion and honor. Weddings, religious ceremonies, and public celebrations demanded garments that communicated respect for the occasion and for the community itself. These clothes did not need to be luxurious, but they needed to be intentional. Preparation mattered. Wearing one's best available clothing was a visible acknowledgement of shared values and social bonds. To appear improperly dressed in such contexts was interpreted as disregard, not misfortune. Clothing thus became a language of participation, signaling who belonged and who stood apart. Over time, the medieval body became inseparable from the garments it wore. Identity was not imagined independently of appearance, because appearance shaped interaction at every level. Clothing accompanied individuals through work, worship, celebration, illness, and death. It absorbed the marks of their lives and reflected them outwardly. To lose clothing was to lose the visible narrative of one's existence. To preserve it was to preserve continuity in a world where stability was rare. Seen through this lens, medieval clothing cannot be dismissed as primitive or purely functional. It carried emotional, social, and moral weight. It mediated relationships between individuals and their communities, translating material conditions into visible meaning. Fabric, once shaped by labor and survival, became the final surface upon which dignity and shame were displayed. In wearing their clothes each day, medieval people carried their history, their limits, and their identity on their bodies, forming a silent but powerful language that defined life in the Middle Ages.